So a few days ago, I talked about an old form control pattern that I used to really enjoy, which I call this a dual select or a double list select. And I looked at how you might create something like that in an Angular 9 application. And what I wanted to do now was do a follow-up to see if I could take this sort of dual select control concept and factor it out into a flexible and reusable component. So just to bring up the idea again. So we have two lists side by side, and the idea is that you can move options from one list into the second list, and the second list is obviously the selected options. And I wanted to do this in a way that was very flexible but also reusable. So I needed a good balance of developer ergonomics, both in the simplicity of consumption but also in the flexibility of rendering. And you can see here that I have some interesting points to take note of. One is when there are no options in the selected list, I have this call to action, so I have the ability to provide some sort of a call to action here. Then also you can see that some of these contacts are favorites, and when I have a favorite contact, I'm actually pulling those favorite contacts out as sort of this secondary selection at the top, right? And then these can go away independently. So let's take a look at how that works in our app component. So after some trial and error and some noodling and borrowing heavily from the browser's native select, opt group, and option elements, what I came up with was this ds select, which is the root select, this ds options, which is our options group, and the ds option, which is basically the value within the options group. So you can see this very heavily mimics the select, the opt group, and the options from the native browser. And essentially, we're going to be using content projection to project the options lists into our ds select component. And then, of course, the ds options will also be using content projection to project the options list. And because we're going to be using content projection and allowing our containers to be quite flexible, we can mix in other non-dual select related code. So for example, here in my selected list, you can see that if I have no selected contacts, I'm including this empty div, this call to action to please add one or more contacts, and that's what we're seeing here, right? So the ds options component doesn't just take ds option elements, it can also take any arbitrary content that can be projected. Similarly, if we have favorited contacts in the selected list, we're going to include this favorites callout, which has its own header and its own list of selected favorite contacts, which we're unrolling here with the ng4. And then here we have another list of options, also using ng4, and these are our so-called normal contacts. So within this single ds options collection here, you can see we have our call to action for empty, our pulled apart favorite contacts, and then our base non-favorite contacts. So again, a lot of flexibility here. Now if we look at the ds select element under the hood, its template's actually pretty simple. We have a flexbox layout here, which has essentially column 1 for the unselected options, column 2 for the controls, and column 3 for the selected options. And you can see that we're just using ng contact to project the ds options component into our layout. And in fact, if we open up our component inspector here, element inspector, what we can see is here is our ds select, right? And here's the options container, the two options containers right here. And if we look, we can see that our ds options get injected and all of the ds options within them get projected, not injected, sorry. Here with the options container for selected, we can see that here's our ds options, and here we have that empty call to action, right, or empty call to action here. And if we add, we can see that now we have the regular ds options. These are the normal ones, and if we pull in a favorited contact, you can see that we now have this favorites contact, which in and of itself has its own set of ds options. So again, a lot of flexibility here in the rendering by using a multi-component approach with content projection, but at the same time, I think what we end up with is a decently simple, let's call it not very simple, but a decently simple consumption model, right? I still have to have the select, the options, and the options, so there's more verbosity and complexity from a consumption standpoint. But in the simplest case, right, if we just wanted to have DS options and nested DS option elements, right, like this is pretty simple, and again, mirrors very closely with what we have in the browser's native select, op group, and option components. Now, to get these select options and option components to play together, it took me quite a bit of trial and error. I don't have a lot of experience, honestly, creating multi-component abstractions. So I used a combination of mechanisms to get all three of these things to play nicely. I used some dependency injection, but I also used some content children query list. And all three of these are in a single file here. I have my DS select component, I have my DS options group component, and then I have my DS option component. And all three of them are here. And essentially these work by deferring, by having the lower level components defer to the higher level components. So for example, when I click on an option, which is the toggle option here, right? If we look on, if I click and I do toggle, the option turns around and defers to the ops group, telling it to toggle this particular option. And if the shift key is held down, I can do the multi-select, right? So normally I just select one at a time, or if I click and then do a shift click, you can see it highlights everything in between. So that's what this toggle option. So the lower level components, like the option, is deferring to the higher level components, the option group. So if we jump to toggle option, you can see that it loops over the options. Now I have to call it toArray here because in this case the options is actually a content children query list, right? So it's like array light, but it's not fully array. And then if I wanted to do something like double click here to move something over, so if we jump down again to the bottom here, double click calls the move in the option. The option turns around and calls the ops group move. If we jump over to move option, the move option within the options group turns around and defers to the select component, its parent component, to move this option from this particular, this option from this options group. So again, we have the lower level components deferring to the higher level components. There's quite a bit of code here, so I won't really go into it. And just for the sake of completeness, here's my app component, and you can see that I have my selected contacts, and my selected contacts are being further broken down into my favorite contacts and my normal contacts. There's some noise here just because we're breaking things down in a more complex way because of the spiciness of the demo, let's call it. But ultimately what you'll see is that if we look at the app component HTML, we have our select and our unselect event emitters, right? So when we're going to be using a unidirectional data flow so that the DS select doesn't have to worry about how to update view models. Instead, when you ask things to be moved around in this component layout, the dual select component isn't actually doing any of that. Instead, it's just emitting these select to move things left to right and unselect to move things right to left. And then ultimately the app component has to take care of turning that event into some sort of logic that mutates the underlying view model. And in that case, it's just about moving contacts between the unselected contacts lists and the various selected contacts lists. And again, that's not really too relevant to the demo, so I'll defer to the viewer to inspect that on their own. But really, I think the real takeaway from this is the power of multi-component abstractions in Angular. We get a lot of flexibility here. A lot of simplicity, but also a lot of flexibility, and then also the use of content projection that is not super limiting, right? I could have done something like my options only accept option tags, But if I did that, I couldn't do, for example, pulling out my favorited contacts into a separate little call out at the top here. I also couldn't have something like a call to action for an empty list, at least not very easily. So by having content projection that is allows more than a very small set of things, we introduce a tremendous amount of flexibility. I think that's not a muscle that I flex very often in Angular, and this is really giving me a taste of really how powerful that is and how powerful content projection can be in Angular. So a lot to noodle on there. So hopefully some interesting things in here. Again, I don't have a tremendous amount of experience in multi-component abstractions, and I certainly don't have a lot of experience with getting kind of hierarchies of components to work together. So the fact that I have dependency injection and content children query lists, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I probably could have done both with query lists, but ultimately this is just what I came up with. So anyway, interesting follow-up.